How's it going, guys, and welcome to the SYNTHO app. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you the realistic rundown of compression. So what a compressor does, but most importantly, where we actually need to use it. Most of you have probably heard about compressors, but if you're someone who wants to know how and why we use compressors, then this is the video for you. Let's get stuck in. So, what is a compressor? Well, a compressor is there to reduce the dynamic range of an audio signal. This means taking the loudest part of the signal and the quietest part and then moving them closer together. This means you're quite literally squishing a signal or even compressing it, which is where the name comes from. So there's 1,000,001 videos on how to use compression, but what I think is important is why and where we actually use compression. So lots of people have heard of compression and then they automatically think they need to add it to every single channel or use it as much as they possibly can, but that's just simply not the case. Obviously, there are lots of different applications of compression, but when we're looking at it in a traditional sense, we don't need it as much as you might think. So unless you need to reduce the dynamic range of a sound, you probably don't need to use the compressor. Don't get me wrong, there are some amazing tricks you can use a compressor for, but in a normal context, especially for dance music, they're not needed as much as you think. So when you're recording a live instrument or a vocal, because they're played by a human, they will behave in a different way. So you might have a vocalist that moves around the mic, or sometimes they'll be singing louder or softer at certain parts. This would be a perfect time to use a compressor because you'll be making the louder parts and the quieter parts closer together. But since digital plugins typically behave in the way that they're programmed, there's often less problems for us to solve. So when you're thinking about when to add a compressor, ask yourself, do I need to make the louder parts and the quieter parts closer together? If yes, this is the perfect time for a compressor. If no, then you probably don't need it. Now let's jump into Ableton and have a look at a compressor and how we can apply it in a practical way. So now let's have a look at trying to apply compression into context in a real track. So a good example would be, say, vocals. But also as a beginner, you're less likely to be working with an original vocalist, so it might not come up as much. So let's try and have a look at using it in some effects. So I have this section here, and it's a perfect place to add some effects. So I'm going to drop in this effects layer, and it sounds cool. But also I want to have a slight reduction in that dynamic range. So it starts out really loud and then it sort of dips down a lot more. So we can use compression to change the dynamic range and make the louder parts and the quieter parts closer together. So let's add the Ableton compressor. And we're going to first have a look at where the threshold is going to be started at. So you can see there, we've got the signal coming in around this section. So we're going to start by reducing the threshold. And you'll see that compression starts to activate when we reduce the threshold. Now the Ableton compressor automatically starts with a reasonable sized ratio. So a 4:1 ratio is like a nice good middle ground for us. Anything higher and we start to get into territory where you're adding a lot of compression, and anything lower and it's a lot more gentle. So we'll leave the ratio as it is for now, but we'll reduce this threshold even more. And you'll see that compressor is starting to reduce even more. So if I change this view here, you've got these three controls here to change the view. You can see we've got a good amount of gain reduction there. If I were to pull this threshold up, that gain reduction is a lot less than when we had it before. So as well, if we reduce the ratio, so like this, versus when we reduce the ratio, you'll see that compression and gain reduction is a lot less. So these controls are really there to decide how squished or compressed the signal is to reduce the dynamic range by a small amount or a large amount. So let's have the ratio back to 4:1 because that's a nice good middle ground. We'll reduce the threshold a little bit more. And then now let's try and listen in the context of the track. So from here, we've obviously applied some of that compression, but so you can visually see what that compressor has done, let's freeze and flatten the audio channel so you can visually see what has happened to the shape of the waveform after the compressor has been added. So let's right click and then we want to freeze the track. Then we want to right click again and then flatten the track. And then we're going to duplicate this twice just so we have a reference point. And then on the second one, we're going to right click and then click flatten track. So you'll see here the differences between the two waveforms. The compressed version has a massively reduced dynamic range. So you'll see the loudest parts, which is the tallest part of the waveform, are much closer together to the quietest parts of the audio signal versus the uncompressed version of the waveform. You'll see here that the louder parts of the transient and waveform are much higher, meaning that the difference between the loudest parts and the quietest parts are much greater than the compressed version. This means that the dynamic range has been reduced on the compressed version, and you can quite literally see on the waveform that it's just been squashed. And that is really the simplest form of using a compressor. This is a perfect example of seeing what's happened because the compressor literally squishes the waveform. And these controls here, such as the ratio, threshold, attack and release, are there to decide how much compression is added, so how much it's going to squish it by, and then how quickly and slowly the compressor starts to act. And depending on the sound you have will depend on what you want to add. But hopefully this will give you an understanding that you only really need to be using compression in certain areas. This obviously excludes types of compression such as sidechain compression and parallel, for example. But we have separate videos on the SYNTHO app which goes into deep detail on those types of compression. This video is really there just to break some of the stereotypes around compression and stop people worrying about their own productions on where they actually should be using compression. So I've now loaded up a default Ableton compressor and I've just added that to a 909 kit just so we can have something to play with. So there are multiple parameters on the compressor, but don't let those scare you because in reality, they're just there to decide how much compression you want to add. So do you want to reduce the dynamic range by a lot or do you want to reduce it by a small amount? And how fast and quick you can do that. And really, when you break these down, it becomes a lot more simple than you think. So the key parameters we're going to be looking at is the ratio. And the ratio is there to decide how much compression is added. So currently it's set to 4:1. And this means for every 4 dB that goes into the compressor, it squishes it to 1. So by reducing the ratio to something like 2:1, so this means that every 2 dB goes into the compressor, it's going to be reduced to 1. So compared to the other ratio of 4:1, this means that there's less compression when it's 2. So in order to have more compression, we need to increase the ratio to something higher, such as 4, 5, 9, anything you need depending on the level you need for your particular audio signal. Then we have the threshold, which is the level that the compressor will start to turn on. So if we had a signal coming in, you can see visually on this compressor that it's coming in to about -9 dB. So in order for the compressor to start activating and compressing the signal, it needs to be at a minimum of -9 dB. Anything less than that, and you'll see the compressor is not activating. This middle meter here is gain reduction. So if there's no light here, you'll see nothing is being activated. But if I were to set the threshold lower, so below -9 to about -12, you'll see the compressor starts to activate because that is the level the signal is traveling into the compressor at. You'll see now we've got a small amount of gain reduction. If I were to reduce the threshold further, more of the signal will be going into the compressor to be compressed. You can see more of the transient is going above the threshold level. This means more of the signal is traveling into the compressor, which means more of it will be compressed. So a lower threshold will mean that more of the signal is being compressed, and a higher threshold means that less of the signal is being compressed. You just need to make sure that it's reaching a certain level before it starts to activate. You can see that's only being activated a little bit, and anything higher, and suddenly it's not activated at all. Now typically these are two of the most important controls when it comes to compression. So if we can play with these, we can then control how much or how little the compressor is acting on the audio signal. So if we reduce the threshold to low, that's going to be activated on more of the signal. But then if we reduce the ratio, so it's a much smaller ratio, you'll see it's being compressed a lot less. Whereas if I increase the ratio, that level is increasing a lot more, and it's reducing the dynamic range of the signal much more. So to split those up into simple terms, if you want more compression on your signal, use a low threshold and a high ratio. And if you want a small amount of compression on your signal, use a high threshold and a low ratio. Next up, we have the attack and release of the compressor, and this is there to decide how quickly or slowly the compressor turns on and turns off. So a fast attack means that as soon as that signal comes through the compressor, it will start to act. As long as it's below the threshold, that compressor is going to turn on really quickly. So you can see here, that is acting in the exact same time as the transient on the kick drum. Now if I were to reduce the attack, you can see there is a slight delay between when the kick goes through and then when the compressor starts to act. So deciding what attack speed is really important depending on the transient shape of your sound. So if it's a sharp sound like a hi-hat or a kick drum, a faster release is more likely to squish the transient of the sound. So you'll lose that bite and that punchiness from that sound. Whereas if you have a slower attack, it will allow the transient to come through first, and then the compressor will start to turn on. So imagine it as you've told your mate to turn on the light when you walk in your room. The attack time is how long it takes for them to turn on the light after you've walked in the room. So you could walk in the room and you might want a 2-second delay. So that means that a slower attack would give you that delay before the light comes on, or in this case, the compressor activates. A faster attack would mean that as soon as you walk in that room, the light gets switched on straight away. Next we have the release time, and this is on the other side of the compressor. So how long it takes for the compressor to fully turn off. So as you can see, a shorter release will mean that as soon as that kick drum is done, that compressor stops being activated. But if I were to give it a much longer release, you can see it takes so much longer for that compressor to stop being activated. So these two controls are really crucial for deciding when the compressor starts to act. So again, we have the ratio and the threshold to decide how much compression we add, and then the attack and the release time to decide when and how long the compressor turns on and off. So the final few controls we have are the makeup gain, and this is there because a compressor works by reducing the level of the loudest parts. This will make the louder parts closer to the quieter parts, but this also means that then that makes the signal quieter. So the makeup gain is there to compensate for the loss of volume you have, bringing the entire signal up. Now, one thing it's important to note is that this does it automatically. And if you want to do this manually, you can turn off makeup gain and then choose the output meter. So rather than having an algorithm decide how much gain is added, you can manually choose how loud or quiet you have your signal after you've added your compression. Next up, we have a few more parameters just to give you that extra bit of control with your compressor. So we have our peak and RMS and expand setting. And this section basically decides where on the audio signal the compressor wants to look at. So peak will be looking at the very top of the audio signal. So these are the very sharp transients and the loudest points of the audio. Then we have the RMS, which means root mean square. This is the average volume of the audio signal that goes into the compressor. Finally, we have the expand setting, but that's for another video because it basically reverses the way a compressor works and it tries to expand the audio signal. So the last two parameters we have are the knee, which basically decides how quickly the compressor is going to act once it reaches the threshold. So a hard knee or a lower dB knee means that the second that you reach the threshold, the compression starts. Whereas a more bendy knee, a higher decibel knee, you can see creates a bit more of a curve, which means that the compression moves in more gradually. Now, whilst it is important to know these, try not to get confused with all these extra parameters. End of the day, these are all there to simply decide how much compression you want and then how the compressor moves. When you're deciding what type of compression you want to reduce the dynamic range of your sound, all you need to be worrying about is how much and how quickly and slowly it's turning on and off. As you dive deeper into the world of production, there is the opportunity to be even more precise when you're using compressors. But when you're still learning the basics and understanding of how they work, then the main controls I would be worrying about are the ratio, threshold, attack and release, and the output. Those are the key components to working a compressor and will give you a lot of control over the dynamic range of the signal. So now after this video, you should be focusing on your creative aspects of production and not worrying about when and where to use your compressors. If you need to reduce the dynamic range of the signal, that's the perfect time to be using a compressor. If that's not why you want to do it, then you don't need to worry about adding that compressor to your track. I see so many beginners worrying about when to use compression and that all the professionals use compression in their tracks. Therefore, in order to make my track sound professional, I need to use compression as well. But that's simply not the case. If you've got any questions, then make sure you drop me a comment below and I'll see you on the next video.